device and blockchain. And we did our first machine learning / AI project about 8 years ago. And so we've been kind of in this space for a very long time. For a while there, it was a little challenging to convince clients of the power of, at the time it was, neural networks, deep learning, that kind of thing. But then, November 2022 happened and incorporated into a language model, right? Where the language model can call this other predictive model for something very specific for their company. And you might call that a small language model, and then it has a more narrow use case. But again, it's kind of not the right use of the term.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of What About AI Agents podcast, where we talk everything about AI agents and their applications in the real world. And today we have Hunter Jensen. He is the founder and CEO of Barefoot Solutions. It's a digital agency out of San Diego. And, he holds a BA in philosophy and economics from University of Virginia. Been in tech for over 20 years. Co-founded previous different companies. And I'll let him introduce himself. And really excited to have you on the show today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Like you mentioned, I've been running Barefoot Solutions, which is a custom software development shop for 20 years now this year. And we've gone through the kind of the technology timeline, staying like at the forefront. We started as a web shop, and then mobile, and then IoT and med device and blockchain. And we did our first machine learning / AI project about 8 years ago. And so we've been kind of in this space for a very long time. For a while there, it was a little challenging to convince clients of the power of, at the time it was, neural networks, deep learning, that kind of thing. But then, November 2022 happened, and ChatGPT and OpenAI kind of opened the eyes of the world to what, we kind of already knew was possible. And since then, it's been there's just been a tremendous amount of interest in generative AI specifically. And now, basically everyone is saying that 2025 is the year of the agent, right? How many times have you heard that? And so, where I saw 23 and 24 as largely experimental, a lot of people tinkering, doing proofs of concept, maybe MVPs and that kind of thing. But now this year we're seeing, serious budgets getting allocated for, large scale deployments at, medium-sized to enterprise-sized businesses right now. And so, it's a very relevant podcast and topic for it, as we're seeing, proliferation of agents across a really wide set of industries.
Yeah, I mean, we've been seeing the same thing on our end. I feel like in the past 2 years, companies have been very eager to explore this space and they had like a mandate from their board of like, well, let's go do something with AI. They didn't know what they were going to do with AI. And then all of a sudden, this year, everybody said, well, people are investing lots of money into this. So we got to use it. And it became more useful. Like over the years, like ChatGPT was not, and those chats were not super useful like a year ago. And now with real-time voice and specialized agents, we were talking to somebody about small language models recently, which are specialized models. It's becoming more mainstream, and the enterprise use case now emerges, and like for SMBs as well as for enterprises. So maybe you can talk to us about some of the cool projects that you are currently working on that you can talk about, and some of the things that your customers are most interested in.
Yeah, certainly. I'm actually I'm seeing a trend here in talking to small businesses and mostly like medium-sized businesses, and then I think it'll trickle down into the small businesses soon enough. But they have the need for talk specifically about like internal systems. So these are systems to improve productivity and efficiency for their employees, which has a certain set of characteristics that make it a little bit unique and have some unique needs. First, they need to connect to a large language model of some sort, but a lot of companies cannot upload their proprietary company information into any of the kind of third-party hosted platforms like OpenAI, ChatGPT, and others, right? They have very sensitive, proprietary, confidential data, but they need to be able to work with it. And then additionally, and that's more for chat, right? But then to take a step further, for agents, they also need it to connect to their other systems that they use internally, their HR system, their CRM, their accounting, their business intelligence, custom databases, all of it. And again, they cannot share these with third parties in a lot of cases. This is very sensitive stuff. But for an agent to be able to actually, when I say agent, I mean AI that can complete tasks versus a chatbot that can just talk to you, but it kind of relies on you to go out and complete those tasks. And for them to be able to complete tasks, they necessarily have to connect to these other third-party systems. So couple all that together, and what I'm seeing is this need for proprietary in-house, on-premise or on the client infrastructure, hosted AI systems with open source LLMs and, kind of almost custom built integrations to help with their unique processes. There's a lot of folks right now that are trying to be pure play SaaS, out of the box, you configure it yourself types of systems. And I think that's wrong. I think that's not the right approach. I think it's a combination of a product, yes, as a starting point to save on, time and costs of development effort, but then it's a customization. I mean, it's more like, like Salesforce or SAP. Like, businesses are snowflakes in a lot of ways, and they have very unique data structures, very unique standard operating procedures and processes, and those need to be addressed in a great user experience if we're going to get these employees to actually adopt this stuff. So someone needs to think those use cases through and build something, that's pretty custom for them. So I'm seeing this a lot, especially this year. A law firm, a company that does clinical trials for pharmaceuticals, in higher education, they all have different use cases and processes, but fundamentally it's the same thing. They need an LLM where they can pull in documents or upload documents from maybe their document management system or maybe a third-party source into a RAG database. And then they need to connect to systems and design agents that can complete tasks on their behalf. And so that to me has been, in terms of like what agents look like in 2025, I am predicting, and I'm already seeing this with clients of ours, of these types of proprietary systems rolling out. One of the things that caught my eye was that Goldman Sachs just released theirs like last month. It was called GSAI. And I'm reading about it. It's the same thing too. They spent years developing an in-house system for their traders and advisors and all the rest to make them more productive and efficient. And they built it all in-house. But most, medium-sized businesses, they don't have the resources or the capital to build something like that without some support. And so that, to me, like, that's our focus in 2025, is building these kind of in-house proprietary systems to help productivity and efficiency of your employees, of your workforce. I think that's the killer use case this year for agents.
Yeah, and we've been hearing about that a lot. We were talking about these small language models that are deployed on premise, trained on the customer data. They are not connected to these large models because, again, of data and security and privacy and all other things that businesses are worried about. Like, you don't want your proprietary business information to become a part of OpenAI's uh, data. And ultimately, we've been seeing the same thing. So, you have a building blocks for tech and LLM building blocks, which is this RAG, which are different LLM capabilities that are easily deployable and customizable. And then you come to these businesses and you build custom solutions around these components. So what specific industries are you currently working in? And what are some of the cool use cases that you've seen so far? Like, what are some of the coolest use cases that you've seen?
Yeah. So internally, we've done some really interesting stuff with outbound sales emails and like crazy personalization, pulling down public records, throwing them into a vector database, querying the database to pull out, these are sometimes 100-page public filings, legal filings, things like that, pulling out bits of information and then writing these emails that are just crazy personalized at scale. We've been doing that for a while. That was kind of our first foray into it. We're working with, a for-profit educational, higher ed institution that's on track to roll out like 12 different agents by the end of the year. I mean, we're talking everything from grading papers to scheduling curriculum to tutoring students. The list goes on and on and on. So education is another area where there's just like a ton of interesting use cases. I mentioned clinical trials. So, the design of a clinical trial is like a 40 to 50 page document. And, there are companies that's all they do is they design these clinical trials. And, talking with the CEO of one of these companies, specifically in veterinary pharmaceuticals, and they estimate that they can produce about 30% more trials per year with the help of an assistant / agent to knock out some of the easier stuff, let's say, right? Like all of this needs a human in the loop. Like, I'm realistic about this. It isn't magic, and it hallucinates and it has errors and all the rest of it, but it can really, and that's why I talk about productivity and efficiency. I'm not talking about replacing people, which I do think, one day, maybe not that far from now, that will be more of a thing. But right now I'm just talking about giving our current people superpowers and enabling them to work a lot more efficiency. So those are some of the kind of, really, I'd like to say practical use cases. Like for too long, it was just a toy, and it was like, isn't this neat that we can do this? Sure, it's neat. I love it too. But like, where's the money? How are we saving costs or driving revenue with these tools? Because this is just new tech, it's new tools, and we just need to be smart about how we're using them to further our businesses. Right? That's where I'm focused and where I spend most of my time thinking. So while those may not be like the most bleeding edge use cases, they are saving time and money and or driving revenue for businesses. That means they're moving the bottom line, and that's where the money's going to be spent on this stuff, on building out agents, is things that impact the bottom line one way or another.
Well, yeah, I mean, ultimately, um, when you talk to businesses and when you try to sell into enterprise, the main question is, what is the ROI and they need to make a business case. And for the longest time, it's very cool was the ROI, and it being cool is not necessarily something that businesses can sell to the board. But nowadays, you're talking about, with things like Cursor, we've seen like developers become more productive, well, questionably more productive, but more productive nonetheless. And basically, uh, what we are also seeing on our end is we can much easily justify getting into a large enterprise with this LLM solutions because they do reduce headcount and they make the existing workforce more productive. So I agree with that, and I think it's a major thing. And this year is a big year for that, and lots of people are willing to do these projects. And what industries are you specifically focused in? Like, what are some of your like? I know you mentioned clinical trials, but who are your like bread and butter customers? Who do you go after?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's shifting sands, I should say, historically versus today. But where I'm focused right now, it's not. We're fairly like industry agnostic in that these solutions work for most companies of a certain size. Um, but what we're really where we really focus is on clients that have very sensitive data.
Mm,
So, if you think about a law firm, maybe the IP department of a law firm, right? They have very sensitive inventions from their clients that haven't been patented yet. Like there is no room for error. Financial institutions, insurance companies, folks that are dealing with a lot of maybe consumer financial data or healthcare, medical device, people that are, companies that are dealing with a lot of private health data, HIPAA compliant companies, things of that nature. Um, you know, this type of kind of proprietary system is very well suited for them who have been kind of like left behind a little bit
mm,
lately, where other companies, like as an example, uh, companies use LLMs and agents for sales and marketing. They've been doing that for a while,
yeah.
right? Because there's not really sensitive data, and they can upload it into whatever, and even if it hallucinates, whatever, it's not that harmful. But the folks who rely on their systems, their kind of internal systems and their internal data, like for their day to day, can't really do that. Haven't been able to do that, and have been feeling like a little left behind. Like there aren't good solutions for those types of companies,
Mm,
and so those are the types of companies that we're targeting. Are ones where building a open AI assistant, as an example, is not feasible for them. That's the type of company we're approaching right now. So there's a bunch of different industries, but they do have a pattern, and we need them to be a certain size. I mean, this is not cheap. It's not crazy expensive either, but like, they need to have already allocated a 2025 AI budget. And if they haven't, I'm worried about them because they they are way behind and they're missing the boat. If they didn't have line items for this stuff in their budget this year.
and I think most of these companies have a mandate from the board at this point to get something in place because everybody don't want to be left behind. Nobody wants to. So my question to you: what does it cost? Like, what does it cost to deploy an LLM on premise and like maybe a SLM on premise? What does the costing for that look like to those clients?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's quite variable depending on the amount of customization. But you know, if we talk about something minimal, where it's out of the box, and then a couple integrations, couple use cases, things like that. We're in the like mid five figures range for an annual budget. So pretty approachable. Now, when you start talking about like heavy customizations, larger organizations, a lot of different data integrations, and a lot of unique workflows and agents and all the rest of it, this can get upwards of kind of low to low mid six figures for an annual budget for something like this, for the initial budget, I should say. But it's very, and that's why I keep saying like companies of a certain size, like very small businesses don't have that budget this year for something like this. And I think the cost will go down considerably in the next 12 to 24 months as there are more entrants into the market and the products get more mature and all the rest of it. But even right now, for a company that's doing 10 million plus in revenue, that's a very approachable budget, I would say.
So how about hosting an LLM on premise? What does the infrastructure cost look like?
Yeah. So, the infrastructure cost is not, it's not quite, well, you have to be really careful about how you do it. I think is my short answer. In most cases, an SLM is plenty good for what you need. And the compute needs on something like that are magnitude smaller than, a full blown LLM. You also have to think very carefully about when to use which models. Most of the open source models these days offer mini versions. They've got their 70 billion parameter llama and their 3 billion parameter llama. Often the mini version is sufficient. And so when you're really strategic about optimizing your prompting and not letting your users just run wild with the heaviest possible compute prompts, then you can keep it very manageable, very manageable. We're talking like $1,000 a month, $2,000 a month for
Really?
pretty decent usage. When you do a lot of those things. Now, if you need, all of the NVIDIA, GPU cluster, like all that stuff, it does get quite expensive.
Yeah, I would imagine. But
I mean, I've seen some that are, $25,000 a month for more advanced kind of machinery. But again,
does it justify,
it's really about design.
Like, does it justify the use case? Like, in which case would you need to spend like $25,000 a month? Like, how much data like are they processing?
Right. Like, so if you're spending $25,000 a month, you better be a large enterprise.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you have a poorly designed architecture. And so you don't need to spend that when you're not dealing in terabytes upon terabytes of data and many, many data sources and all the rest of it. But you have to be really smart about how you design the system, because it's easy, especially now, because this is new stuff, right? There's no, quote unquote, like experts really. If it takes like 10,000 hours to become a master of something, like how many experts in LLM, cloud infrastructure are there? Like probably zero, or like the guys that work at the major companies, and that's about it. So again, you have to really kind of know what you're doing and be very careful and monitor very closely, and don't let compute costs kind of run away from you. Like one of the things that's nice about on-premise actually is that there are like guardrails in that it just stops working at some point because you're like overclocking it, right? And so it will just like stop functioning. But that doesn't mean the cost keeps going up, right? Whereas if you build like a really scalable cloud infrastructure, you can kind of accidentally scale to very large costs if you don't have guardrails in place. But again, if it's well designed and it's very thoughtful about what models it's using for what and what kind of compute requirements they have. And, let's keep in mind, we're not talking about training models in most cases here, right? We're talking about using models. When you hear about these like massive data centers and all the rest of it, that's for training, which is a much, much heavier, resource intensive task than using these things.
Right. But so when they talk about training SLMs, do they mean you just set up a vector database and you have like your RAG and you get all your data, and then SLM just you're not running inference on that data, like you're not doing actual training?
Right. See that people kind of misuse the terminology right now, which is frustrating. In that, like almost nobody is training language models.
Yeah.
Right. Like the big boys are, because they have the resources to do that.
Yeah.
Oftentimes, when someone says they're training a small language model, they mean just what you described, which is not even training anything at all. They're quote unquote training it by connecting it to a RAG database that has specific information for their use cases, and they're calling that training. But in the traditional sense of machine learning model training, that is not training. Now, what is training would be if you are actually fine tuning a model with an additional data set and incorporating it into the model itself. But the reality is that's like very rarely do you need to do that. Like RAG databases get the job done at a much lower cost and in a much simpler manner than fine tuning a model to incorporate like a massive set of training data. Like, another thing people will might maybe call small language models are not in fact language models at all. They are, neural networks that are trained to predict something other than language and then incorporated into a language model, right? Where the language model can call this other predictive model for something very specific for their company. And you might call that a small language model, and then it has a more narrow use case. But again, it's kind of not the right use of the term. But in that particular case, you are training a model, just like we've been doing for many years, but it's not really a language model. It's a predictive model. It's a deep, it's a neural network. So you're
It's like
right.
a
I
LoRa,
think
like
people are
like a
misusing the
LoRa,
term.
like basically just to tune the output, and
Mm-hmm.
so you have these LoRa's, and they can be used to tune your model's output and make it better in some areas and improve it. So,
That's right. And so like Alora is a great example of tuning the output of a model to a particular style or a particular use case. I will say for these business use cases,
don't need a
we don't
LoRa.
need the LoRa's. We just don't need them. Right now, it's like people playing with anime imagery that are using these LoRa's. I'm not seeing them hardly ever in business use cases. They're just not needed.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Fair. I mean, unless you need like some very, very specific calculations done or something like that, and then maybe that's not a good use, anyways. All right.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so that actually explains it very well. So you essentially just run a very small model on like a very, 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 very like on-prem on a very inexpensive hardware, and because okay, let's say a call center. So a call center for like a medium-sized business gets maybe 1,000 calls a month, right? So like or 1,000 support requests a month. You don't need like a huge amount of infrastructure to support that. Honestly, it's just
You don't. I mean, I'm running 70 billion parameter llama on my laptop,
right,
and it's fast,
right.
right? So yeah, when you make good decisions architecturally, you just don't need that much hardware. Do you need to go
No, no,
check?
no, that's fine. My wife
Okay.
is taking care. My family over, all taking care of the kid. It's 2 months old. That's all it does is eats and rides.
I
So,
remember. I remember. Mine's 3 now.
does it get better?
It does. It gets really fun. Actually,
Uh,
it's super fun right now.
yeah, right now
But
it's
the
not.
first 6 months are brutal.
Yeah.
Brutal.
This is really interesting. I think from the standpoint of the the training. This actually clarifies a lot of the things that many people probably have questions about, because there's a lot of misinformation about like training these models, and like you're not training anything. Like you rarely ever have to train anything, and you rarely ever have to. And actually, do these models perform better when they are trained on less parameters, or do they perform worse? So let's say you have a 70 billion llama. How well is it able to answer? Like if it has access to a vector database with those customer support questions, um, how well will it perform? Will it?
Perfectly well, sufficiently well. Um, if you have the vector database with the relevant stuff in it, you don't necessarily need it to be as knowledgeable as you do need it to be reasonable, meaning capable of reasoning to make good decisions about the information in the vector database, right? But I don't need you to know everything about every piece of, every one and zero out in the data landscape to be able to help me with my pretty narrow use cases at my job. I
And
just
how do
don't.
we restrict what this model can answer? It cannot. Is it just prompt engineering, or is there any specific techniques that you can use to stop it from accessing outside? Because a lot of problems. Let's say you roll out a chat GPT for your customer, like an OpenAI, one of those models, and then it starts to recommend the competitors of your customer to your customers, and that's not necessarily like a very good um, use case. But how do you restrict these smaller models, or do you not have to restrict them because they just don't have access to those parameters?
Oh, you've got to restrict them. Absolutely, you have to restrict them. So it's kind of like a two layer approach, or maybe even three. So one is very detailed and aggressive system prompting, to set the guardrails and the rules of operation, kind of default to saying I don't know if there's any doubt. There's also a programmatic layer where literally like old school like word filters
Mm.
Can sometimes be helpful because the system prompts are not always followed,
Mm-hmm.
and the longer they get, the more confusing they might be. So, to your example, just like never saying the name of your competitors, you can write that as a system prompt. But if you want to be really sure, you write a little bit of code, and it will not do it. Code is reliable.
Right.
And then the third layer, I would say, is like really making sure that you have your feedback loop in place. Someone needs to be looking at these conversations regularly and tweaking system prompts and or programmatic filtering
Mm.
for things that nobody thought of yet, but we don't want them saying. And so building like observability and the ability to continually improve is really fundamental. Like that's not something we add on later. That's something that comes in V1 or the MVP of a product like we're talking about,
Mm-hmm.
is the observability piece, so that there's just so many unknowns that we need humans reviewing. One of the things that we've been tinkering with, we have not put into production, but I'm liking the idea of it, is basically bringing in another LLM to kind of check the work of the first LLM, if that
Mm.
makes sense.
Yeah,
If you
we do that for video analysis. On like we have
okay,
an
yeah,
LLM that
similar
verifies.
concept here,
Yeah.
right? But like, you've got Llama telling you one thing. Let's go ask and see what Claude thinks about it before
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
show
Yeah.
our user. And one of the other important details, like in terms of how I'm approaching things this year, is actually really focused on employees and not customers. Not consumer facing or customer facing, because of the risks of some of the things that you hear about, lawsuits for airlines that give you the incorrect bereavement policy for tickets, or but your risk is a lot lower when it's your workforce that's using this stuff, and they're trained and well informed on the possibility of errors and to always double check and do all these things, right? The risk is just a good bit lower than when you start exposing it to your customers or potential customers.
Yeah, especially in compliance-heavy countries like US and Europe, where people just love to sue everybody for good reason, bad reason, just love to go to court, and it's you always have to protect yourself as a business. So I think, especially rolling out public-facing solutions like that, and where it can potentially give bad or harmful advice, and this is why, as you mentioned, prompt reinjection or like instruction reinjection of like forbidding it from doing certain things is so important. And I think this is why Anthropic has been getting a lot of hate recently, because they've been working really hard to make sure that Claude is like compliant with all this things. And that sort of lobotomized Claude but at the same time, I think if you're gonna roll it out to a large audience and you have all these people, and like remember some like LLM wished some LLM coached some kid to commit suicide or something recently, or something like that. You just don't want that happening, right?
That's right. The work that Anthropic is doing in that area, it's frustrating for users because it just means that Claude says no a lot more than ChatGPT, right? And that's annoying, and I understand why that's annoying. But at the same time, the work they're doing is so important for safety.
Yeah.
Our safety, right? Human safety. We need this stuff, and it's not simple. These are hard problems to solve, and we need people really focused on working on them. And, I say kudos to Anthropic for putting in that work, even if it makes their product maybe not quite as easy to use as it used to be, or as some of the others are. Because, it's just entirely mission critical to all of this stuff.
Right. Because jailbreaking is fun when you're doing it, but it's not fun when some kid accidentally jailbreaks your agent and your agent coaches the kid something that is not supposed to happen, and then you are criminally liable, because ultimately they're going to have AI legislation, and that legislation is going to most likely hold the companies that are using those AIs as accountable, and not like the OpenAI or Anthropic. At least that's what I think. I don't know, but yeah, from a compliance standpoint,
I think so.
It's a really interesting topic to discuss. But I'm really thankful that you joined us today, because you kind of helped clear up some of the questions that I had, for example, because I kind of knew how these things work, but at the same time, having somebody reconfirm my thoughts and suspicions is really, 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 really good, because there's a lot of misinformation floating around. People talking about training these models, people talking about SLMs, but in reality, they just take like an off-the-shelf llama and they attach it to a vector database, and that's the product, and that's always been the product.
Yep.
And
yeah, well, it was a pleasure. It was a great conversation, and I really appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, and I'd love to have you back on the show, maybe in half a year, so we can have another discussion and see how all these things progressed and how things have changed.
Sure it would be a very different conversation 6 months from now.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, everyone. This was
all right.
Hunter Jensen.
Appreciate it. Take care.